Bao Daï Solution. Hello and welcome back to our history of French Indochina. If you are a faithful listener and you like what you hear, first of all, thank you. And please hit that subscribe button. Leave us a review or a rating anywhere you listen to your podcast. And if you can, talk about it to people you know as well and who might be interested. All that goes a long way and it means the world to me. So thanks again. Now, let's get back to it. Where were we? It was the summer of 1947 and the French just could not wait for the monsoon season to end. You see, they had a military operation planned for October, and they were sure that Operation Lea, as they dubbed it, Operation Lea would strike a fatal blow to Ho Chi Minh and the DRV, and it would put an end to all this unpleasantness. Indeed, the DRV back then was weakened and isolated. Without diplomatic or military support, it was hard to see how it could survive the French onslaught. So in the summer of 1947, there was a massive military build-up and a threat hanging over Ho Chi Minh's head. We'll get to that soon. But before we do, I want to focus first on the political danger that is threatening Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV. The root cause of the political threat against the DRV was, of course, its diplomatic isolation. The Ho Chi Minh government had tremendous domestic support, but it had no allies. Therefore, the risk for Ho Chi Minh was to lose his popularity if another personality or another movement appeared that was deemed more capable of leading the fight for independence. Ho Chi Minh knew this, and his Vietnamese rivals knew it also, and the French knew it too. On the French side, a guy named Léon Pignon was a very influential advisor. After having worked with Amiral d'Argentlieu, Pignon was now an advisor to High Commissioner Bollard. And while Paul Mus oversaw contacts with Ho Chi Minh, Pignon's assignment was to make contact with Bao Dai. You remember the young emperor that the French put in his place in 1931? That was episode 4. The citizen Vinh III who abdicated in 1945 in favor of the Viet Minh in episode 5? Yes, you remember Bao Dai? This is who I'm talking about. In 1947, Bao Dai had drifted away from the DRV's orbit, and he had been living in Hong Kong since 1946. For Pignon and many in the French colonial bureaucracy, the ex-emperor was the solution to their political problems. They started working on what they called a Bao Daï Solution. What was it? Well, it was a Machiavellian strategy that can be described as follows. The French wanted to tout Bao Dai as an alternative to Ho Chi Minh. By doing so, they hoped to unite all the anti-communist forces behind the former emperor. And when that happened, the majority of Vietnamese would desert Ho Chi Minh and rally behind this nationalist alternative. The idea was to reduce the Viet Minh support to a minority so that the Viet Minh becomes just a faction among others. Thus weakened, the Viet Minh would have only two choices. One, they could accept the French conditions, but if they opted to stubbornly continue the fight, the war would no longer be a colonial war, no. Ladies and gentlemen, it would be a war between Vietnamese communists and Vietnamese anti-communists. And France would turn to the US and say, look guys, we are not trying to subjugate anyone here. We are out there on the front line of the fight against communism. This was utterly disingenuous, of course, but the strategy was tailor-made to bring the United States on board. Listen, you Americans, this guy Ho Chi Minh is not a patriot at all. He is a dangerous red, a Bolshevik, who is just doing the Soviet Union's bidding in Asia, The real patriots, the real Vietnamese patriots are with us. Look, even the emperor is with us. To be clear, in 1947, France had no intention of granting independence to Vietnam, whether it was Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam or Bao Dai's Vietnam. But Bao Dai was likely to be favored by the Americans, and France was prepared to do anything to get the United States diplomatic, military, and financial support. Philippe de Villers, a French historian who published a history of Vietnam in 1952, says that Paris used the Bao Daï Solution, meaning setting up a non-communist Vietnamese regime, to neutralize American opposition to colonialism. But why did the French think that Bao Dai was the most qualified to lead the new Vietnam? Firstly, there was an old colonialist belief dating back to Albert Sarraut and Pasquier that the Vietnamese people were Confucian law-abiding people. The simple understanding that the French had of Confucianism was that it asked people to obey authority within families and within the country. Pignon himself had worked in Indochina before the war and believed that the emperor was worshipped as a sacred figure and that the peasant masses would rally to Bao Dai the minute he showed up. And Pignon thought he could then manipulate Bao Dai to serve French interests. But as Christopher Gauchat says in his Modern History of Vietnam, there were even two Bao Dai solutions being worked at in 1947. We saw the French one, but there was also a Vietnamese one. You see, after the outbreak of hostilities between the French and the DRV, as well as the start of the Cold War, the survivors of the VNQDD and the Dai Viet, who had been driven into exile in China, came out of woodwork and tried to get back into the game. Their leaders, including our friend Nhat Linh, created a united front of all the anti-communist forces and contacted Bao Dai. The Vietnamese nationalists too intended to play the Bao Dai card to attract American support. The United States were helping Chiang Kai-shek in his fight against Chinese communists, weren't they? The US had granted independence to the Philippines in 1946, hadn't it? Well, if the Vietnamese nationalists had the Americans on their side, they could kill two birds with one stone. Wrest independence from the French and at the same time crush the Viet Minh. Well, as we know today, that did not eventuate. On the contrary, in the coming years, the Americans would even help the French keep Indochina. But this was 1947, and non-communist Vietnamese nationalists still held on to their dream, and to be honest, their calculations were not far-fetched. So in March 1947, the United Front formally broke with the DRV. I say formally because despite the repression of 1946, the nationalists were still theoretically members of the Viet Minh League. But by March 1947, the alliance with the communists was over. The new United Front formally pledged its allegiance to the ex-Emperor Bao Dai and called on him to seize power. So Bao Dai is being courted by the French, by nationalists, by everybody. So what did he do? Well, the former emperor kept his cards very close to his chest. Ho Chi Minh's former supreme advisor welcomed everybody and listened to everyone. But he acted as if it was beneath him to support this side against the other. He was kind of above the fray type of attitude. In July 1947, for example, he said that he could be a mediator between the French and Vietnamese parties, making sure to mention that he was neither for nor against the Viet Minh, and that peace would return if the French finally realized that the spirit of the Vietnamese people was no longer the same as 10 years earlier. It was clear that Bao Dai did not want to wear the suit that the French wanted him to wear. So he reminded the French that he wanted the same thing as the DRV, complete independence of a unified Vietnam, meaning including the southern province of Cochin China that the French considered separate. So two Bao Daï solutions, a French one and the Vietnamese one. But these two would gradually converge and become one. Why? Well, the first thing that alarmed the Vietnamese nationalists was when Paul Mus went into the jungle to pay a visit to Ho Chi Minh. That showed that the DRV was still a force the French had to reckon with, and that the DRV would be part of any settlement the French reached. And if there was one thing that gave Viet nationalists shivers, that was collaborating with the communists again. These guys still had PTSD from 1945-46. So immediately after Paul Mus' visits, the Vietnamese non-communist nationalists sent angry letters to High Commissioner Bollard and asked him to only consider non-communist nationalists. Well, this was music to the ears of the French authorities in Indochina, and in Paris for that matter. At the same time they were protesting against French overtures to Ho Chi Minh, the Viet nationalists launched a large-scale movement to woo Bao Dai and convince him to lead the national opposition to Ho Chi Minh. They organized many rallies, they wrote pamphlets, and they canvassed. And on September the 9th, 1947, 24 delegates and exiled nationalist leaders met and officially asked Bao Dai to seize power. And it worked. Bao Dai's armor began to crack. But the pivotal event that will make Bao Dai say, okay, I'm going in, was a speech that High Commissioner Bollard gave in Ha Dong on the 10th of September 1947. This was a long-awaited speech where High Commissioner Bollard was to define what were France's intentions in Vietnam. The High Commissioner in the speech stated that France would negotiate with all the Vietnamese representatives except the DRV. But at no point in his speech did Bollard utter the word independence, so eagerly awaited by all nationalists and by the former Emperor Bao Dai. As a result, the Viet Minh immediately denounced the speech, which was, predictable. As for the non-communists, they were a bit in a bind. On the one hand, they were bitterly disappointed that the French did not say independence. However, they were also very happy because it had been made clear that the communists could not be involved in any settlement with France. So what they did was to push harder for Bao Dai to come and lead their movement. He would be the one to gain independence from France, not Ho Chi Minh. So 1 week after Bollard's speech in Ha Dong, Bao Dai officially broke with the DRV in an address to the Vietnamese people. He agreed to be the negotiator between Vietnam and France and expressed his willingness to obtain independence of a united Vietnam. In short, he rejected Bollard's proposals but accepted France's outstretched hand. This was one of the turning points in the history of Vietnam in the 20th century. As Christopher Gauchat says, the nationalist decision to negotiate with the French Republic in 1947 meant that they put the fight against their communist rivals above the struggle for independence. Because of the Red Terror they suffered in 1945-46, these nationalists concluded that the best strategy was to use the French first and foremost to get rid of their Viet Minh enemies. But this strategy was very risky. First of all, how could Bao Dai and nationalists negotiate on an equal footing with France? They had no leverage, no army, no government, no territory, no popular base, nothing. The danger here for the nationalists was that they would simply tag along behind the French, and that France will take them for a ride and not give them independence. In fact, that was clear from the beginning. For example, the nationalist actions were limited to the areas under French control. And as early as 1947, Dai Viet militants were working on the administrative committees set up by the French in Hue and Hanoi after the ousting of the DRV. The second risk inherent to the nationalist strategy was that it was assuming two things. One, that the communists did not stand a chance against the French Expeditionary Corps, and two, that France was seriously considering granting independence to the countries of Indochina. Spoiler alert, the nationalists are in for a rude awakening, because the aim of the French was not to make Bao Dai the sovereign of an independent and unified country. It was to keep Indochina French. And their second assumption would be proven wrong as well. The French were not going to get rid of the Vietnamese easily. So it is now time to move to the end of the rainy season of 1947 and talk about Operation Lea, the masterstroke that was supposed to destroy Ho Chi Minh and the DRV. General Valui entrusted the planning and the conduct of the operation to General Salon, aka Le Mandarin, the Mandarin, because Salon had served in Indochina for a long time. Salon had 32,000 men at his disposal, 3 paratroopers battalions, armored vehicles and artillery, plus air and amphibious support. The first objective was to strike at the heart of the Viet Minh machinery by killing or capturing Ho Chi Minh and his government. Second objective, to cut off the transit routes for supplies from China. So the first move was to drop paratroopers on Bac Can, where the DRV government was established. That move was to kill and capture all the top echelon of the DRV. After that came the pincer movement to capture the bulk of the Viet Minh troops. A column leaving from Lang Son, the town at the extreme east of the Chinese border, well, that column would move west towards Cao Bang on the Route Coloniale 4, before lunging south towards Bac Can. A second column, amphibious this one, meaning that it advances on the rivers, well, that column would move up from the south to the north on the Lo and Gam rivers. At least, that was the plan. And Operation Lea was launched on the 7th of October 1947. The French experienced issues right away. To start with, the paratroopers that were supposed to jump on Bac Can and kill the DRV government, well, they didn't surprise the DRV government. The parachute drop was too slow, and the 1,000 paratroopers who descended on the town had to be dropped in 3 batches, so to speak, instead of descending on force. Despite this though, we now know that the Ho Chi Minh and Zap slipped through the net, but it was a very close escape. Same thing for the DRV regular troops. They managed to retreat unscathed, but they had to leave behind huge quantities of weapons, ammunition, and documents. At the end, the so-called DRV capital, Bac Can, was conquered by the French, and the DRV minister, Nguyen Van To, was killed as he was trying to escape. The very next day, however, Vo Nguyen Giap, having launched a counterattack, surrounded the French paratroopers in Bac Can. Then, the northern pincer was delayed. This column included 10 battalions, and its assignment was to clear the northern flank and prevent any escape to China. The 10 battalions marched 200 km along the RC4, the RC4, from Lang Son to Cao Bang, before going south towards Bac Can. Well, this northern pincer was delayed by many ambushes, destructions, and mining of the roads. These guys did not arrive in the Bakkan area until the 13th of October, a full week after the launch of the operation. And when they arrived, they were immediately attacked by the Viet Minh forces, which prevented them to come and rescue the French paratroopers pinned down in Bakkan. And it was only 3 days later, on the 16th, that Moroccan riflemen managed to make a breakthrough and loosen the stranglehold on the beleaguered paratroopers in Bakkan. And if you thought the northern pincer had copped it hard, better thought for the southern pincer. There were there 4 battalions sailing up the river on landing barges and assault ships. But these guys never reached the battlefield. They were also delayed by ambushes, booby traps, and distractions. Well, that was a shame because there had to be 2 pincers for a pincer maneuver to work. You know, these things work in pairs like scissors or talkie-walkies. Well, after all the above setbacks, on the 8th of November, the French High Command called off Operation Lea. Another operation, Ceinture, meaning belt, was launched in December, and the French launched an attack against the southern part of the Viet Bac, which is the Viet Minh sanctuary. But again, the Viet Minh troops dodged the blow, and the French looked like the boxer throwing massive blows in the air. On December 22nd, the French withdrew again to the Red River Delta, leaving only a string of isolated military outposts on the Route Coloniale 4 to control the Chinese border. So what to make of all that? On the glass half full side, the DRV headquarters, Bakkan, had been conquered, and the French High Command announced that 9,000 Viet Minh were killed, which was probably a bit overblown. Moreover, the Viet Minh had left behind a lot of equipment and documents. On the glass half empty side, though, the main French objective of neutralizing the Viet Minh's political and military apparatus had not been achieved. So, let's agree to call it a draw. But for the Viet Minh, to draw with the French was akin to a victory. And indeed, the Viet Minh tiger was not dead. Faced with the French elephant, it avoided confrontation and remained crouched in the jungle. And in this upper part of northern Vietnam, the terrain was so difficult that the French were just unable to gain a foothold. Therefore, the Viet Minh could afford to be patient. What more, the French did not know it yet, but they had thrown an unpinned grenade into their own backyard by setting up military outposts on the Chinese border. But we will cross that bridge when the grenades explode in 1950. At the end of 1947, the French had to face up to a new reality. The war would be longer than they imagined, would be longer than they wanted. Therefore, it was now urgent to make progress on the political front. The Bao Daï Solution therefore became more important than ever for the French, but also for the Vietnamese nationalists, who were in a very bad position now that the DRV did not simply crumble under French pressure. The non-communist nationalists were now allied to the French. How in these conditions could they hope to wrest independence from them at a negotiating table if France was ready to fight a war because they refused the same independence to Ho Chi Minh? Well, we will see that next time. 1948 was going to be very eventful. And to make matters more complex, the international context will weigh more and more heavily in the decision of all the parties. So until next time, thank you again for your attention and see you next episode. Bye.